Just imagine finding your own words in someone else's mouth, being praised and celebrated while you sit silently across the table, watching your creation being claimed by another. You want to know the worst part? When I finally stood up for myself, my family called me ungrateful. Let me take you back to the beginning. This is brilliant work, James. The depth of emotion in this piece, I never knew you had it in you. My mother gushed, her voice carrying across our family dinner table. My brother's face flushed with practiced modesty as he accepted the praise, our father nodding in solemn agreement. I sat across from them, fork suspended between my plate and mouth, watching the scene unfold with a familiar hollowness expanding in my chest. The words they were praising, the monologue about a daughter's complicated grief for her father, had poured out of me at 3 a.m. 3 nights ago. Words I'd texted to James when he'd called panicking about his upcoming showcase, begging for, "Just a little help, Em, please." "Thanks, Mom. It just came to me, you know? Sometimes the words just flow." James caught my eye briefly before looking away, a flicker of something. Shame? Defiance? Crossing his features. I swallowed the bite of food that had turned to sand in my mouth. This wasn't the first time I'd witnessed my words being celebrated as his creation, but something about tonight felt different. Perhaps it was the particular piece they were praising, one I'd written during a sleepless night after visiting our grandfather in hospice, my heart raw with complicated emotions about a man who'd been simultaneously loving to me and cruel to my grandmother. The words had been my attempt to make sense of how we love flawed people, how we mourn not just their passing, but the reconciliations that will never happen. And now those words were being passed off as evidence of James's sensitivity, his emotional depth. My writing had always been my refuge, the place where my voice, so often interrupted, talked over, or simply unheard in the symphony of my family's louder personalities, could finally resonate with its true timbre. But for the past 2 years, that refuge had become a resource mine for my brother's burgeoning acting career. It began innocently enough. James needed a monologue for an audition, something fresh that directors hadn't seen performed 1,000 times. I spent a weekend crafting it, pouring my own complicated feelings about our grandfather's abandonment into a piece that left my brother stunned when he first read it. "This is exactly what I needed, Em. You're a lifesaver." He got the part. And then he needed another piece, and another. Each time, the line between helping my brother and enabling my own erasure blurred further, until evenings like tonight became routine, watching my words celebrated as his creation. "The emotion in your delivery was so raw," my father said, refilling James's wineglass while mine remained half empty. "You really captured something universal about grief. Will we get to see this performed?" he continued. "The showcase is next Friday," James replied. "I put your names on the guest list." "We wouldn't miss it," my mother said with the fierce pride she reserved for my brother's accomplishments. The same pride that had been conspicuously absent when my short story collection was published in a small literary journal last year, an achievement met with polite nods and a quick change of subject. "What about you, Emma? Any new stories we should know about?" My father's question seemed almost an afterthought, his eyes already drifting back to James. "Actually, yes," I started, feeling a small surge of courage. "I'm working on—" "James, tell them about that director you met," my mother interrupted, not even registering that I'd been speaking. "The one from the Independent Film Festival." I excused myself early from dinner, claiming a headache. No one questioned it or tried to convince me to stay. As I gathered my coat, I overheard my mother's voice. "She's always been so sensitive. Remember how she used to cry when we'd visit Santa at the mall?" The comparison of my legitimate frustration to a childhood fear stung, reducing my feelings to a personality quirk rather than a response to being repeatedly overlooked. It was a familiar tactic, one that had made me doubt the validity of my emotions for years. In the solitude of my apartment, I opened my laptop and stared at the document containing my newest play, a full-length piece I'd been working on for months, crafting in secret hours, stolen between my job at the bookstore and family obligations. It was the most honest thing I'd ever written, a story about a woman whose voice was literally stolen by her family, who could only communicate by writing words that disappeared from the page once read. It was raw, messy, and unmistakably mine. The cursor blinked at me accusingly. James had been hinting for weeks about needing material for an upcoming festival submission. He didn't know about this play, but he would ask soon. He always did. When did I become so invisible? The thought formed as I closed my laptop, too exhausted to write but too restless to sleep. That night, I dreamed of standing on a stage, opening my mouth to speak only to find that no sound emerged. The audience leaned forward, straining to hear nothing. In the front row, my family watched, expressions bored and impatient. My brother stepped onto the stage beside me, placed his hand on my shoulder, and suddenly my voice came out of his mouth. The words warped and twisted until I barely recognized them. I woke gasping, sheets tangled around my legs, my throat tight as if I'd been screaming. The next morning at the bookstore, I shelved new arrivals with mechanical precision, my mind replaying last night's dinner on a tortuous loop. Mrs. Abernathy, one of our regulars, noticed my distraction. "Heavy thoughts for such a beautiful day," she observed, her eyes kind behind cat-eye glasses. "Want to share the burden?" Something about her gentle inquiry, so different from my family's dismissive patterns, broke through my practiced composure. Before I could stop myself, I was telling her about James, about my writing, about the years of invisible contribution to his success. "My dear," she said when I finished, "that's not help, that's theft." The word landed like a stone in still water. Theft. I'd never allowed myself to frame it that way, always cushioning the reality with softer language. James was borrowing my words. We had an arrangement. I was helping his career. "I suppose it is," I admitted, the truth of it settling into my bones. "And what are you going to do about it?" The question hung between us, deceptively simple. What was I going to do? Continue as I had been, watching my creativity fuel someone else's dreams? Or find the courage to reclaim what was mine? "I don't know," I answered honestly. "Well," she said, patting my hand, "not knowing is often the first step to finding out. Emmy, you have to help me out. This is huge. The kind of opportunity that only comes once." James's voice crackled through my phone, urgent and entitled. "The Atlantic Theater Festival is accepting submissions, and the deadline is next month." I leaned against the bookstore counter, grateful for the empty shop. It had been 3 days since my conversation with Mrs. Abernathy, 3 days of turning over her words in my mind like stones in a river, watching them transform under my attention. "I can't this time, James. I'm working on my own projects." "But you're always working on something. Come on, just let me see what you've got. I bet we can adapt it." The casual presumption in his tone ignited something in me, a small, dangerous flame. No. The word felt foreign on my tongue, simple yet revolutionary. "What do you mean, no?" His confusion was genuine. In our family dynamic, my refusal was unprecedented. "I mean, I won't be giving you any more of my writing to pass off as yours." My voice remained steady despite the violent pounding of my heart. The silence stretched between us before he finally spoke, his tone shifting from confusion to wounded accusation. "I've never passed off anything. I've always appreciated your help. You know how much pressure I'm under with my career, while you're just..." "Just what, James?" The flame inside me grew hotter. "Just writing for the joy of it? Just working a regular job while pursuing my passion? Just existing without demanding everyone else fuel my ambitions?" "That's not fair, Emmy. Neither is taking credit for my words." He sighed, the sound of someone dealing with an unreasonable child. "Look, I've never claimed to be a writer. Everyone knows I'm an interpreter. You give me words. I bring them to life. That's collaboration." "Collaboration requires acknowledgement. When was the last time you mentioned my name alongside yours? Is that what this is about? Credit? Fine. I'll make sure to thank you next time." "There won't be a next time," I interrupted, surprising us both with my firmness. "I'm submitting my play to Atlantic myself." The silence that followed was different, heavier, charged with the shifting of a long-established order. "You can't be serious." His voice had hardened. "Emmy, you're not an artist. You're too sensitive, too private. You don't have what it takes to put yourself out there." His words struck with practiced precision, finding all my tender spots. Doubts he'd heard me voice over late-night conversations, vulnerabilities I'd trusted him with. That he would wield them against me now revealed how thoroughly he'd come to believe in my supporting role in his life story. "I guess we'll find out," I said, ending the call before he could respond. My hands trembled as I placed the phone on the counter. The small act of defiance left me simultaneously lighter and terrified. For so long, I'd drawn a sense of worth from being useful to my family, particularly to James. What would happen now that I was choosing a different path? That night, I finished my play with a renewed sense of purpose, typing through tears that felt more cleansing than bitter. I titled it Invisible Ink and submitted it to the festival the next morning before I could lose my nerve. For a week, I heard nothing from James or my parents, an unusual silence that was both relieving and unsettling. Then came a text from my brother. Family dinner Sunday. Mom insists you come. I considered making an excuse, but realized avoidance would only delay the inevitable confrontation. This is part of it, I told myself. Standing up means showing up. Sunday arrived with ominous weather, dark clouds hanging low, promising a storm that seemed too perfect a metaphor for what awaited me. I arrived at my parents' house with a knot in my stomach and a rehearsed speech in my mind, neither of which prepared me for what happened. The moment I stepped through the door, James engulfed me in a hug. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been a selfish jerk." Stunned, I awkwardly patted his back, meeting my parents' confused gazes over his shoulder. My mother looked anxious, my father embarrassed. Over dinner, James explained that he'd spent the week reflecting on our relationship, on how he'd taken advantage of my generosity. He promised to credit me for past work and support my future endeavors. "I want us to collaborate properly," he said earnestly. "Your words, my performance. Imagine what we could create together." My parents beamed at this apparent resolution. My mother reached over to squeeze my hand. "See, darling? All that fuss for nothing. This is much better than competing with each other, isn't it?" Something in her tone, the relieved satisfaction that the natural order had been preserved, made me pause. I looked at James more carefully, noting the gleam in his eye that didn't quite match his contrite words. "What changed your mind?" I asked him. He hesitated, exchanging a quick glance with our mother. "I realized how much your talent has contributed to my success. It would be selfish not to acknowledge that." It was a perfect answer. Too perfect. And then I understood. My play submission had been a threat, a disruption to the family system. This wasn't reconciliation, it was containment. "How did you hear about my submission?" I asked, watching all three of them freeze momentarily. You mentioned it," James stammered. "No, I didn't. I only told you I was submitting it. I never told any of you which play or what it was about." I kept my voice level, watching realization dawn on their faces. "So how did you know to approach the festival committee claiming co-authorship?" The silence that followed confirmed my suspicion. I felt sick. "They called me," I continued, "to clarify the situation. Said you'd contacted them claiming we'd written it together, that I was trying to cut you out." "Emmy, it's complicated," James began. "We've always worked together on these things." "No, we haven't. I've written, you've performed. There's a difference." I stood up, unable to stomach the charade any longer. "I trusted you with my words, and you've been taking them. Now you're trying to take credit for a play you've never even read." "Emma, please sit down," my mother said, her voice tight. "You're making a scene." "I'm stating facts," I replied. "And I'm leaving." The first real hint that something was changing came 3 weeks later when my mother called, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Your brother is devastated, Emma. How could you do this to him?" I closed my eyes, already understanding what had happened. "He told you about the play. He told us you stole his concept and submitted it yourself, after everything he's done for you." The absurdity of her accusation might have made me laugh if it hadn't been so painfully predictable. "Mom, that play is mine. Every word of it, just like every other piece James has performed over the past 2 years." "That's ridiculous. James has always had a gift for storytelling. You've always been jealous of his talent." It was the same narrative that had shaped our childhood. James was the star, I was the supporter. James was dynamic, I was withdrawn. James needed the spotlight for his future. I was simply being difficult when I asked for recognition. "I won't argue with you about this," I said, a strange calm settling over me. "But I won't withdraw my submission either." "Your father and I are very disappointed in you, Emma. Very disappointed indeed." After she hung up, I sat in the silence of my apartment, waiting for the familiar wave of guilt and shame to wash over me. It came, but alongside it was something new, a steadiness, a certainty about my decision that couldn't be shaken by their disapproval. That evening, I received an email from the festival committee requesting a meeting. My play had made it to the final round of consideration. The committee meeting was held in a small room above the theater, 5 serious-faced individuals arranged around a battered table. I'd expected questions about my play, its themes, its structure, my inspiration. Instead, the first question blindsided me. "Miss Lawson, we've received some concerning communications regarding the authorship of Invisible Ink. Would you care to address the situation?" My heart raced, but my voice remained steady as I explained the history with my brother, producing emails, drafts, and notes that established my sole authorship. I'd come prepared, anticipating James might escalate his claims. The committee chair studied me with sympathetic eyes. "You're not the first writer to face this situation. Family complications can be challenging." "Is this going to affect your decision about my play?" I asked. "The play speaks for itself," she replied, "and it speaks quite eloquently." 2 days later, I received confirmation that Invisible Ink had been selected for production. In a moment of either masochism or hope, I forwarded the email to my family. James didn't respond. My mother sent a terse "congratulations" that felt more like an accusation than a celebration. But my father called, his voice hesitant but warmer than I'd expected. "I read the press release," he said. "They're calling you a fresh, distinctive voice. That's something, Emma." "It is," I agreed, not knowing what else to say. Is the play about us?" he asked, vulnerability threading through his words. "About your brother?" The question caught me off guard. "It's fiction, Dad, but fiction comes from somewhere." He was quiet for a moment. "I'd like to read it, if you'd let me." That night, I mailed him the script, a note attached. "This is my voice. Thank you for wanting to hear it." The months that followed were a study in family dynamics under pressure. James alternated between wounded silence and explosive accusations at family gatherings. My parents treated me with a cold politeness reserved for disappointing relatives one must tolerate at holidays. The only ally I found was my Aunt Catherine, my mother's sister, who pulled me aside at a family dinner and whispered, "About time you stopped writing his scripts," confirming what I'd long suspected, that my role as James's ghostwriter wasn't the secret I'd thought it was. When Invisible Ink was selected for the festival, the final fracture occurred. My mother called to inform me that they would not be attending the performance. "We've already committed to attending James's showcase that weekend," she explained, though I knew for certain his showcase was the following week. "You understand how important his career is at this stage." I did understand, not just about his career, but about the roles we'd all been assigned in our family story. My success didn't fit the narrative they'd invested in, and rather than rewrite that narrative, they would simply ignore the contradictory evidence. Opening night arrived with a mix of terror and exhilaration. Standing in the back of the theater, watching actors bring my words to life, hearing the audience respond with laughter and tears in all the right places. It was an alchemical experience, transforming years of silence into gold. After the performance, amid the small crowd gathering around the cast and production team, I heard a familiar voice. "Excuse me, pardon me. I need to get through to my daughter, the playwright." My father stood before me, looking somehow smaller than I remembered, his expression an uncomfortable mixture of pride and bewilderment. "You came?" I said, unable to keep the surprise from my voice. "Your mother doesn't know." He shifted uncomfortably. "I told her I had a business dinner." The confession hung between us, not just that he'd come without her knowledge, but the implicit acknowledgement that my achievement required subterfuge to be witnessed by my own father. "What did you think?" I asked, bracing myself. He looked at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was familiar. The father character, his blindness to his daughter's pain. He stopped, swallowing hard. "Was that how you felt all this time?" Before I could answer, he continued in a rush. "James told us, after your mother called you. He admitted that you've been writing his pieces, said it started as a favor but got out of hand." "And you believed him?" The question escaped before I could temper it. My father looked away. I wanted to believe you both somehow, that you were collaborative, that it was mutual. He met my eyes again, but watching this tonight, hearing your voice so clearly, I know that wasn't true. It wasn't an apology, not really, but it was an acknowledgement, the first crack in the family mythology that had confined me for so long. Will you come to dinner next week? He asked. I'd like your mother to hear what I heard tonight. I don't think she wants to hear it, Dad. Probably not, he agreed with surprising candor, but I think she needs to. The week between my father's invitation and the dinner was filled with a strange, suspended feeling, like standing in the moment between jumping and landing. I continued normal routines, working at the bookstore, meeting with a local playwrights group I joined, but underneath ran a current of anticipation mixed with dread. When the review of Invisible Ink appeared in the local arts paper, glowing, calling it a searing examination of family silencing and self-reclamation, I didn't share it with my parents. Not yet. I tucked the clipping inside my journal, a private validation to counter the doubt that still whispered in quieter moments. The night before the dinner, James called. We hadn't spoken directly since the confrontation. Dad says you're coming to dinner tomorrow, he said without preamble. Yes. Look, I know things got messy. I didn't mean for it to blow up like this. I said nothing, letting the silence stretch until he continued. I want us to find a way forward, Em. You're still my sister. And that means what exactly? I asked. That I should forget how you tried to claim my work? How you told Mom and Dad I stole your concept? I panicked, he admitted. When you refused to help with Atlantic and then submitted on your own, it felt like you were trying to hurt me. The self-centeredness of his perspective was so breathtaking I almost laughed. It wasn't about hurting you, James. It was about claiming what's mine. But we were a team, he insisted. Your words, my performance. We complemented each other. A team shares credit. A team acknowledges each member's contribution. I took a deep breath. You wanted a resource, not a partner. His silence told me I'd hit the mark. I'm not angry anymore, I said, surprising myself with the truth of it. But I'm not going back to how things were. So what happens now? He asked, his voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Now we both move forward. You find your own words, or collaborate honestly with writers who receive proper credit. I continue developing my voice. I paused, and maybe, eventually, we find a way to be brother and sister without the exploitation. After we hung up, I sat looking out my apartment window at the city lights, feeling a weight lifting that I hadn't fully recognized until its absence. The anger that had burned so hot had transformed into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but a clarity about boundaries that felt like reclaiming territory long surrendered. The dinner was as uncomfortable as I'd anticipated. My mother maintained a brittle cheerfulness, asking about everything except my play. James didn't come, claiming a last-minute audition. My father watched the performance with the anxious attention of a stage manager anticipating disaster. Finally, over dessert, my mother set down her fork with deliberate precision. Your Aunt Catherine says your little play was quite successful. That's nice, dear. It wasn't little, Helen, my father interjected. It was professional. It was powerful. My mother's smile tightened. I'm sure it was very nice for a first attempt. It wasn't her first, my father said. According to James, she's been writing professionally for years. We just haven't been paying attention. The silence that followed was absolute. My mother's face went through a complex series of expressions before settling on indignation. Well, if she's been hiding her writing, how were we supposed to know? I wasn't hiding it, I said quietly. I was sharing it with James, who was presenting it as his own. James would never. He already admitted it, Helen, my father cut in. The boy confessed everything. My mother's eyes filled with tears. I don't understand why you're both turning against him like this. He's sensitive. He's an artist. So is Emma, my father said, his hand finding mine under the table. We just never noticed. My mother looked at me then, really looked at me, perhaps for the first time in years. You've always been so self-sufficient, Emma. So quiet. You never seem to need anything from us. The familiar justification for their inattention stung, but I recognized it now for what it was. Not truth, but a story they'd told themselves to explain away their focus on James. I needed you to see me, I said simply. Not just as James's supporter or your dependable daughter, but as myself. You've always been ungrateful for everything we've given you, she replied, but the accusation lacked its usual conviction. What exactly have you given me, Mom? I asked, not unkindly. The freedom to be overlooked? The opportunity to pour my talent into advancing someone else's dreams? My mother had no answer, but my father squeezed my hand. It wasn't resolution, but it was recognition. The beginning of a new story we might write together. One where all our voices could be heard. As I drove home that night, a memory surfaced. A childhood moment I'd nearly forgotten. I was 8, James 11, performing a backyard play for neighbors. I'd written it, a simple fantasy about talking animals. Halfway through, James had begun improvising, changing my carefully crafted lines for laughs. When I'd protested, my mother had shushed me. Don't be difficult, Emma. He's making it better. All these years later, I finally had an answer. No, he wasn't. He was making it different, making it his. And the difference mattered. My words would never again disappear like invisible ink. They had become indelible, finally and irrevocably mine.